Good evening. My name is Sharon Sandman. I am with the NAPS program. Thank you for joining our composting webinar this evening. Our presenter will be Kevin Lombard of New Mexico State University Agricultural Science Center and San Juan Extension.
Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. So I guess before you start a conversation about composting, you have to understand why it's important and why we should be doing more of composting. And it's really about nutrient recycling. It's an accelerated nutrient recycling process. And this is just a pretty busy slide concerning nitrogen, but I've highlighted or circled the salient importance about nitrogen and why it's in what it's constituent of: proteins, DNAs, RNAs, chlorophyll in leaves. Essentially, everything that defines living organisms. And completing a cycle, a recycling process, a circle of life, is returning these nutrients back to soil, and then those nutrients again are taken up by plants to complete the circle. So by adding food waste, leaves that have fallen off trees, manures, we're essentially taking that nitrogen, breaking it down, and returning it back to the earth. And the nitrogen can only be taken up in two forms in plants. That's ammonium, NH4, or nitrate, NO3. And there's not going to be a quiz on this today, but if you really want to get geeky about it, this is kind of the processes that happen, that the forms of nitrogen that are taken back up. These, of course, can be replicated through synthetic fertilizers. So we have, you can go to the store and buy a bag of synthetic fertilizer to get the same thing, or you can take something natural and break it down and achieve the same compounds. And plants are chemical feeders. They can't differentiate between a synthetic fertilizer and an organic source of fertilizer. So that's just a little bit on nutrient recycling. And in terms of nitrogen, I've circled where it's all really taking place in composting. It's these decomposers. These are fungi and bacteria that are breaking down these dead waste materials in the soil, converting it to the forms I mentioned, ammonium and nitrate. And then this is back into a plant available form. So you're completing the circle of life, basically. So what is composting? It's this biological decomposition of organic debris. And it also, it's accelerated because there's heat involved. And this heat can also has some benefits to killing undesirable organisms. And it's kind of accelerating a natural process. It's producing a natural soil amendment. The benefits of composting are that you're reducing organic materials into the waste stream, the landfill. So if you're taking your food scraps and you're dumping them into the garbage, all you're doing is just adding to the landfill. You're creating more methane. And it's just not a beneficial use when you could be taking that, separating it out, and using that back into your garden. And as I mentioned, it's characterized by initial rapid heating, followed by an aging process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take anywhere from weeks to months. So what we're doing to create compost is we're taking what are considered carbon sources and nitrogen sources. So all you have to do is really think of carbon as a source of brown materials like leaves, and you look at nitrogen as a source of, leafy greens, to kind of break it down in a more simplistic ways. And I have some other resources that I'm going to share later to try to demystify this carbon nitrogen ratio that you might often hear about. You're adding you have microorganisms involved. Water is essential, especially in the semi-arid or arid region that we live in. Without water, you're not really going to have that heating up of the compost like it should. You're not going to have that decomposition occur in oxygen. So oxygen is just like why it's important to stir compost piles. And then what you get out of it is this composted carbon, the heat's being produced by microorganisms feeding on the decomposing matter, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. So this is what my compost pile may typically look like. It's often a heap of food scraps. We were at one time getting food scraps from San Juan Regional Hospital. So it just really depends on what your scale and what you want to achieve. For most backyard composting, just your table scraps and anything that's biodegradable will work just fine. If you're looking at more of a like farm scale, you might need to source additional resources. So in our case, we are sourcing scraps from San Juan Regional Hospital, and a lot of times restaurants and kitchens would be happy to get rid of this if you provide them with a separate garbage can or a collecting vessel, and you're willing to come pick it up on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. We found that they were happy to get rid of their table scraps and happy to participate in not having to send this to the landfill. You can actually go in there and eat some of this if you're hungry, and it's on a breakfast if you're really desperate. But I don't know. That's just me. But I wouldn't recommend. But some of the food that gets thrown out goes into this compost waste stream. But thinking of compost pile does not necessarily should mean not a debris heap. So just throwing things in a pile and then just pitting more piles upon piles is not really the proper way of composting, because we kind of refer to this as a rot pile, and especially if you do not add water, you're just going to have all that sit there, kind of dry out in our desert environment, and it's never going to break down properly. So you have to take a methodical approach to when you're doing this type of compost pile system. But this is the simplest way to start out. What I say that you have to do with any compost pile is you have to stir it. All right. So that stirring action introduces oxygen into that pile, and you should be adding water. So you might have to put a little sprinkler on it and wet this down while you're stirring. But by getting it well stirred and maintained, you start that heating process that starts that rapid decomposition. And I've gone out to my pile in the dead of winter, and if it's properly maintained and heating up, sticking your hand into it, you can actually feel the heat coming off of that pile, even on the coldest January morning. What we want to try to avoid is these static rot piles, not stirring them up, because that's just going to it might just kind of break down slowly, but it never will really fully break down. Now, there's some caveats I'm going to talk about here in a minute on some bioreactors that are coming out. So there's really not, in my humble opinion, there's never really any right or wrong way of like starting a compost pile. You can start it on a small scale in a bucket under your sink with vermicomposting, adding worms and letting them break down stuff, or you can do it outside in a pile. If you do it outside, move it away from your house, is my recommendation. Sometimes there's smells involved, and sometimes compost piles may attract rodents or animals that want to come in and eat. So I suggest moving this away from your house. You can be as fancy as you want, creating little areas that are subdivided. In this example, the pile on the left is maybe the most early, just recently started, and then it's kind of shifted to where at the very end you get your compost that's already aged and you're constantly cycling. This is one strategy of doing a compost pile, is like segregating things out this way. So anyways, I'll show you some other examples from the web here in a bit too. So pile building, you add your nitrogen. If your carbon and nitrogen debris is 30-1, you're going to hear this carbon nitrogen ratio. So you want to have some balance to this. Not too much leaves and not too much rotting fruits and vegetables. You want to have this balanced out. And then you want to be mixing this, like I said, and adding moisture every time you mix it. Try not to layer it up, mix every 2 to 3 days when you're starting out. And I actually find this as a way of exercise. And so instead of looking at it as turning my compost pile as a chore, I look at it as a form of exercise, because you get kind of a moderate workout when you're using a shovel. And what I do is I just kind of start from one end and move my pile over, turn it. If it's too big, I might, get on a tractor or borrow my neighbor's tractor if I trying to go that big. But again, adding that water will certainly help to keep that process going. And that aeration, as I mentioned, is important to introduce oxygen, because if you're not aerating and you have a moist rot pile, it'll go anaerobic. It'll start stinking. It'll draw flies. So a properly maintained compost pile should not have any significant odors coming off of it. If you have odors coming off of it, then you need to turn it. Pile won't heat. Some common problems: it's too dry or it's too wet. So I mentioned that around here things dry out really quickly, and you won't get any decomposition. You'll get slow decomposition happening if it's too dry. If it's too wet, it goes anaerobic, meaning there's no oxygen in there. If your carbon, which is you have like a big pile of leaves, but you don't have a lot of like fresh, wet, green materials, fruits and vegetables from your table scraps or manures, then you need to add a nitrogen source, because that nitrogen source is going to get those microbes really active, and they're going to start breaking down that nitrogen source, and they're going to start going crazy on the rest of the pile. So you don't have proper mixing. You need to mix. Maybe the pile is too small, so you need to have a larger pile to retain the heat. This is particularly maybe problematic if it's really cold environment like here in Northwest New Mexico. If the pile stinks, it's too wet, and you're not mixing it, as I mentioned. So you want to mix it and create channels in it. Or you have your carbon to nitrogen ratio is too low. That means you have way too much like freshly table scraps and manures and whatnot, but not enough like leaf material in there. And the components they're separated, so you need to keep them mixed up. So I wanted to mention real fast the Johnson-Su bioreactor. This is something that we started playing around with fairly recently, but it's been some research is being done over at the NMSU Science Center at Alcalde. And Dr. Johnson and his wife, Dr. Su, he's a microbiologist, and he created this this idea of a more fungal rich compost and something that you don't need to stir. And the idea is you create this cylinder, and it's got this wrapped with this sort of black landscape cloth, and there's pipes that actually go in there in the middle that have holes in them, and then it's sitting on top of the pallet. I don't know if you can see that. And what this does is it allows airflow, and the idea is that you're not going to have to constantly mix it, and you let it kind of compost down over time, and it takes about a year before you get more of a fungal rich compost that can be then added to a field, back to the field, or inoculate seeds. And the claim is that you can increase your yield significantly with this type of extract. I'm just learning more about it now, so I'm fairly new to it as well. But this is just a kind of a geeky slide for my colleagues over at the Alcalde Science Center. Amy Larson is the contact there, and they're doing these types of studies where they're looking at different recipes of mixtures and looking at bacterial and fungi counts and that kind of thing. So more information can be found just by Googling the Johnson-Su reactor in NMSU. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of biosolids. So biosolids is something that I did work on in part for my PhD here at the Science Center Farmington. And I was looking at, so biosolids are just a fancy word for composted sewage sludge. And sewage sludge is, an afterthought from wastewater treatment. So we flush our toilet, we walk away, those nutrients go into the waste stream, they wind up in municipalities often, and we forget about them. We forget that there's a source of nutrients that a lot of municipalities just landfill. So there's a lot of elements, plant available elements in this, and it's a resource that I believe we should be also exploring as a source of composting. So I did some work with tree plot work and composted biosolids, and I looked at it. I look at biosolids as, I call it human manure. So it's kind of you look at animal manure, you look at human manure, and so that's just kind of my feel on it. My problem that I have here was we were trying to grow these tree crops, and we were having iron chlorosis or iron deficiency. And we found that because our soil pH is so high, usually we find our soils to be above 8 in alkalinity and high in calcium carbonate. This tends to cause what's called iron chlorosis. And if we want to treat that with a synthetic fertilizer, we can do that, but it costs a lot of money. And, why not look at something that's like nutrient recycling from human manure or an organic source? And so Albuquerque has a composting facility on the west side of town. So as you're driving I-40, it's kind of like right after you leave Albuquerque, you'll see a sign for I think a shooting range or something. That's where it's located. And what they're doing is they're taking one part of the sewage sludge that comes from their wastewater treatment plant, and they're adding it to 3 parts yard waste. So chipped leaves and branches and that kind of stuff. And they're pulling it out of the waste stream from going to the landfill, and they're taking it to this facility, and they're mixing it up. And this is on a commercial scale. And then after it's treated, they get this rich composted sewage sludge or biosolids or human manure. That's what I call it. And when you look at the comparison of our natural soils here, and you look at the biosolids, this goes for any type of manure source, cows, chickens, rabbits, human manure. There's always going to be a salt loading component. And that's what this electrical conductivity EC means. I'm getting real geeky here, but just wanted to point this out, that with any manure source you're going to have, or even any kind of fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer is always going to have a salt component to it. But when you look at the nitrogen, that nitrogen recycling, I talked about in the very beginning, look how high the sewage sludge biosolids are. So they're high in nitrogen. And this is our soil right here. This is what we have in Farmington, very low nitrogen content. And the phosphorus is really high also in these. And that's part of the treatment process. All these elements, these are plants need these elements for survival. So all these micronutrients, zinc, iron, manganese, copper, the biosolids were all higher in these micronutrients. So I guess my point is here is that this is a product that plants need, and it's been shown in our lab work that it has very high rates of these natural fertilizers elements in it. Now, with anything with applying something like this to agriculture fields, you have to consider things like lead, because you have lead in water pipes and things of that nature. So that was one thing that we wanted to explore also. And we found that the Albuquerque biosolids were very low in lead. So these are just loading rates here. And we found that there was a very low amount of lead, no risk at all, is what we found. So we did this tree study here at the Science Center, and we applied the compost to the soil, just using a regular spreader. And the scientific information here is a little dense for this evening, I think, but the main point is like looking at the growth of what we found on trees growing under the biosolids at regular rates of what you would apply manures at 20 tons per acre. We had significant higher yields on using this as a composted fertilizer source. So I don't know, what I'm trying to say here is let's maybe think about the prospect of using some of these byproducts, even our own waste stream, as a source of compost. So yeah, just again, some geeky figures, because I like to throw out figures and graphs. So, but these are just different growth parameters of these trees, and when we applied the biosolids at the highest rate, we got the highest growth rates. And compared to a fertilizer here, a synthetic fertilizer, it was significantly higher with the composted biosolids. Same with all these other parameters here. I didn't see Michael Patrick on the conference call, but he's a numbers guy. And when you look at the cost of using something like a waste stream, like composted biosolids, you actually could do this much cheaper than buying synthetic fertilizers. That's kind of my point here. So we corrected the iron chlorosis problem with this composted product. We had residual soil iron, manganese, and phosphorus, which were needed by plants to grow. Greater biomass by applying this. We didn't have a salinity problem because we used just a lower rate, not full strength. We found minimal environmental risk. We have questions about some other things in this, so it hasn't been widely recommended for anything else up to now, but it's something that we would like to explore further here in Farmington. So kind of in summary, composting will reduce land waste. That's really important, especially as we're, challenged by, um, I don't want to get philosophical here, but we're challenged by a number of things these days, and anything that we can do to add soil organic matter and nutrients back is helping our growing at the backyard level to the farm scale. And because we're actually nutrient recycling instead of taking the stuff that we may want to throw away just to the landfill. And just how we approach composting, there's no, like I say, right or wrong way. This depends on your scale, what your objectives are. Are you throwing compost on edibles or ornamentals? I think when you start talking about manures, you need to think you need to be careful that there's other things that if you don't get a compost pile to heat up, that heating process, you could be introducing things like E. coli onto your field, and this could be a problem for food production. So your objectives, you need to be maintaining your compost pile and following guidelines and making sure you get that proper breakdown, and then you'll be just fine. I'm gonna end my talk here, and what I wanted to try to do is, are there any questions so far? I'm just kind of blabbering at this point.
Do we have any questions out there? Are you interested in any of these composting projects? Anyone have a question? We have the Q&A box down at the bottom, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
So I just, if you can still see my screen, I wanted to pull up some good resources about some of the things I talked about. I don't know if you can still see that, my screen.
Yes.
So this is a guide by called Backyard Composting, and it's on the NMSU Cooperative Extension publications. It's called Guide H110, and it gives a really good overview of the introduction to composting and how to go about it. And it's very well illustrated, and it breaks down some of these concepts too. It talks about 140 degrees Fahrenheit or higher to kill most pathogens. So in weed seeds. And so you can get just a regular like cooking thermometer that you might use for a turkey or something like that to stick in the soil, just to kind of keep an eye on how hot your compost is getting. Different alternatives to composting, the composting process and composting organisms, this whole concept of carbon to nitrogen balance, and then just different types of like these low carbon sources and high nitrogen sources would be like grass clippings, food scraps, vegetable waste, coffee grounds, cow manure, horse manure, poultry manure. I never see human manure in here, which, there's reasons for that. Mainly from the food, like GAP. However, it's something to chew on your mind and maybe Google around on human manure. And there's some books out there on the subject as well. Human manure. I think there's a book that is called Human Manure. High carbon sources are things like leaves, straw, corn stalks, paper, and sawdust. So many things that are brown and dried things like dead leaves. This is a good time to start raking leaves up and building a pile. and then start building a pile up with your leaves that fall off trees, and then start throwing in your food scraps and a manure in there and mix it up, and then throw some water on. That'll start heating it up, and you'll be amazed. In November, you might start seeing steam off of that. So there's good information on in here: surface area, aeration, moisture building a compost pile. These tumblers, this is something that I didn't have slides of, but tumblers work great, and they can be built very simply out of a used, clean 55-gallon drum, food grade, things that, you can get these at some places that have like saline solution in them, or I can get these at Wines of the San Juan. I used to be able to buy them at Wines of the San Juan in just east of Farmington or Bloomfield. And you don't need to buy one. You can buy one if you want, or you can just build one and just roll it around too. It's just however much you want to spend. Some of these cost anywhere up to $800. Like we had one at San Juan College that was about $800. And the point is with the barrel system is that you can do this. This is really good on a home scale, because you can throw all your stuff in there and then just rotate it to get that mixing action going. Where I see problems with this is that people forget to add the water into it, and so it just becomes like this dry mass. It never rots down. So don't forget to add water. I mentioned these different types of segregating structures. So you can be fancy or you can be cheap. I tend to be cheap, and like used pallets work great for this. This is okay for these holding units, but again, you have to somehow find a way to stir this, or if you investigate the Johnson-Su reactor, this really needs to be raised off the ground to have the aeration according to the Johnson-Su reactor. So something to consider. Yeah, and composting materials, leaves, sawdust, weeds. You don't want to put weeds in your compost pile. Okay, like I'll put weeds in my compost pile if they don't have seed heads on them. But if they have seed heads and you put them in, you run the risk of that weed becoming noxious in your garden after you spread your compost out in the spring. So be very careful about what you put on there. There's, they mentioned manure, rabbit, chicken, livestock manure, except for pig, excluding, these weeds, these perennials like bindweed. Like you don't want bindweed to get reestablished in the compost pile. Diseased plants. So the reason why you don't want to put diseased plants on is because you may not get your compost pile hot enough to kill that pathogen, and you may just be inoculating your soil with something that may have been diseased. So this is where, pig manure, this is a gray area for me. Pet manure, this is a gray area for me. I kind of want to do more research on this. I'm always kind of curious about like, why are, this is kind of an off topic subject, but it goes back to human manure and that kind of thing. Like, I think more work and research needs to be done. They say don't throw meat or fats or oils or cheese products onto piles, because you run the risk of attracting animals that will come and browse on your compost. In my experience, yes, you can get animals coming around like raccoons and skunks. If something's in a closed system like that barrel, and you can exclude animals, if you're gonna if you're going to have something that's going to decompose, like why not try to compost it? It's how I feel about it. So anyways, there's the maintaining, troubleshooting. Vermicomposting is with worms, and there's links to all this, compost values and uses. And there's all kinds of good information down here as well. So I just wanted to draw the audience's attention to this guide, Backyard Composting. I think it's a pretty good source of information. I'm gonna
Kevin,
stop there.
Kevin, we have two questions.
Okay.
One is from Joe, and it's is there compost to red weeds?
So the question, what's the question now?
Is there compost to red weeds, like to get rid of weeds, I guess?
Can you throw the question in the chat box?
Yes, it's in the chat box.
Oh, I'm having a problem getting access to that.
Is there compost to red weeds?
So compost to red weeds. Yeah, you know, you can, I mean, we're constantly weeding in our garden, right? We're throwing, what do you do with those weeds? Well, I take most of them to my compost pile. And if I get that compost pile hot enough, it'll break down. And like I say, if you don't have weeds that are seeding, you'll be fine. It'll break down. If you have just vegetative matter, throw it on your compost pile. I hope I'm answering the question.
And then, well, I have heard of a family that's doing composting, and they have like bullheads around their home on their land. They were telling me that they use that bullheads in their compost pile as the greens before it flowers and before it starts the seeds. So, and they have accomplished.
Yes, I think that's good information.
Okay, I have another question from May, and it's how about using human manure from old outhouse deposits?
So this is being recorded, right?
Yes.
I'm a fan of human manure, and the reason for this is in my situation is twofold. Number one, I'm on a septic system, and I have to maintain that system. Now, with a septic system, you're essentially doing nutrient recycling, right? You're adding it to basically a reactor, and then your effluents going out into a leach field. My philosophy on it is that why not use human manure? I think it's from the studies that I did with the Albuquerque biosolids, it was literally the best fertilizer that man could make. And in a lot of municipalities are landfilling this. They're not even using it beneficially. On a large scale, there's a product called Malorganite, and you can go and buy this at nurseries. And it's actually Milwaukee composted biosolids. That's why it's called Malorganite. Albuquerque will sell theirs also, or I think they even give it away. On a small, if you scale it down to an outhouse level, it can be achieved. And the way I approach the way I would approach it is I have ornamentals in my garden, and I would use that compost around my ornamentals that are not going into a food unless I knew that I had achieved the proper heating temperature to kill E. coli. But the way I see it is human manure, in making a recommendation to use poultry or rabbit manure. Cultures around the world are using human manure, essentially because they have to. They have no other fertilizer source, and so I would love to maybe put a presentation together on human manure in the future, and maybe put some science, back it up with a little bit more science on it. From my experience with the biosolids, it was a viable source of fertilizer for trees. I hope I answered the question.
I hope that answers your question, May. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I would, if you want to reach out to me, May, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. Yeah, great information. We plan to compost. It's just something that good to do. And it's crazy, like in places like San Francisco, that's where my in-laws are. They actually separate out their table scraps into a bin now, where they come and collect it and make it on a large scale. There's like large scale composting operations out there. So it goes from small scale to large scale, but the point is to recycle that waste.
Kevin, would you like to put your contact info in the chat box for these ladies?
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, we really appreciate the information you shared with us.
I want to make a plug that if you have a question or a concern about your soils, and especially heavy metals, we have a machine here at the Science Center that we can use to measure heavy metals in soil rapidly. And we would be glad to test people's soil for free if they have a concern about that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your information on composting, Kevin. It was very useful, and it just encourages our producers to try and try something new in composting instead of buying, the compost we usually buy in Home Depot. I think this would be a great method, and then we could have healthy soil.
Yes, I agree.
Yes. So thank you so much. We have here our upcoming webinars. It'll be on October 28th, Greenhouse Management webinar by Daryl Yazzie Jr. So if you're available, join us for this wonderful information from Daryl on greenhouse management. I also would like to introduce our team. Let me introduce our web pages. We are on Facebook, also YouTube channel, and we also have a monthly newsletter. Our team is made up of Jesse Jim, who is our field coordinator, and Sharon Sandman, and also Jenna Johnson. We thank you for joining us this evening. Have a good rest of your evening. Stay safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, and have a wonderful rest of October. The Native American Producers Success Project is a collaborative effort between the NA Inc., a nonprofit organization, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, and the NA College Land Grant Office. The project is funded by USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement, Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. The goal of the NAPS project is to increase the profitability and long-term sustainability of Navajo farmers and ranchers. To achieve this goal, activities in 4 key areas are being undertaken to improve Navajo farm and ranch operations, increase Navajo farmer rancher knowledge of and access to available programs and technical assistance provided by the United States Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Navajo Nation, the New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service, the Dene College Land Grant Office, and others. Also, to strengthen the organizational capacity of the Navajo Farmer and Rancher Congress to address the current and future needs of Navajo farmers and ranchers, and facilitate Navajo farmer ranchers' use of USDA's NRCS, FSA, and MRA programs.